I'll go get some help.
Immaculate is a 2024 movie about a woman seeking to perform her vows to become a nun in Italy and gets entangled in a plot about a nefariously conceived child. It's kind of funny in that the first act of this movie is kind of the exact same thing as the recent movie, The First Omen. This movie centers on Cecilia, a woman from the US that comes to an Italian convent in order to take her vows as a nun. When arriving with little to no ability to speak the language, she is met by a nun that seems to hold a grudge against her, and another one that takes to her immediately, who seems to have a bit of a checkered past for being a nun. The First Omen is a home for wayward children, and this one is a home for wayward old folks. It's just hard not to compare these two movies because they came out around the same time, and that description I just said could basically describe either movie. I mean, where they separate is I found that The First Omen swung a little more wildly in multiple directions, where this one played it relatively safe until the last sequence. And that middle of the road feeling felt prevalent through the whole film. While from a story perspective, The First Omen got kind of ridiculous and made some pretty dumb character and story choices, this movie keeps everything relatively subdued and more low-key, which is a plus, but it also felt a little too underdone. Ultimately, not a ton actually happens in this film. For instance, there is a cold open where we see the nuns capture an escaping nun and bury her alive as punishment. So we already know that the nuns are trouble at this convent. So there's really no mystery as to the intentions of when they bring Cecilia in. So this whole movie is just sort of waiting for her to catch up with the rest of us and, of course, get the entire picture. So there isn't a lot of discovery other than like a few details of exactly why they're doing what they're doing. And to be fair, unlike The First Omen, I actually liked this convent's motivation. It was crazy, but it did kind of fit with the characters involved. I still find it a little crazy that they find a woman that's never been to Italy before that would travel across the world to take her vows in a place she didn't know. I mean, this does happen in both films, and in both movies, they're recruited by the head priest. This one mentions a line where the priest is, I guess, really good at finding people, and he's able to locate her specifically to invite her there. But that seemed like a little bit of a stretch because they're kind of acting alone, and they don't seem to have a ton of resources. But, I mean, aside from that, this at least felt more plausible than First Omen, which was riddled with "are you kidding me" kind of story points. However, if we're talking in terms of from an atmospheric perspective, then the pendulum swings in the other direction, where I thought The First Omen really grabbed the ball and ran with it, providing some great visual and creative styles, and an aesthetic that really kept me engaged. This movie, once again, kind of just does the bare minimum to be competent. It looks fine. It's just the same series of Gothic church convent shots lit with candles. It's not bad, but more meh, competent, safe. Except for the very end. And I'm not going to go into the spoilers or anything, but I will say the last few minutes in this movie was the only time that I actually felt like it grabbed my attention and went for something. It's a shame that it didn't happen earlier in the film, but I guess that's better than nothing. And what do I mean by safe? Well, this movie really felt pretty vanilla in terms of look and feel. Now, I'm not saying horror movies have to do this, but one of the things about horror movies is they really can play with the presentation maybe a bit more dramatically than other genres. Like certain genres, I think, favor certain elements of filmmaking. Drama tends to be a bit more of a writer's medium. Older comedy tends to be more of an actor's medium. New comedy leans more into the editing. And I've always thought horror as a director's medium. And this movie chose to implement its premise of a newly vowed nun finds a dark secret in the convent she's in as somewhat of pedestrian in style. It's fine, but it also doesn't take many chances or big swings. I feel like too much of this film is just, hey look, it's Sydney Sweeney. For most of the movie, she just kind of walks around in a dark convent with a candle. That's kind of it. And speaking of candles, I had a real hard time nailing down the time period of this film. At first, I thought it was set in like the 70s or something because the car looked old and everyone walks around with candles. But there's plenty of lamps and lights, and they do have an ultrasound machine in the convent. And then there's this scene in the car where a priest gets a cell phone call. I think that surprised me the most about this film than any other aspect. I mean, I'm assuming if the priest is a cell phone, this is at least mid-2000s. And if that's the case, why is everyone walking around with candles? What's up with the goddamn candles? Are there no flashlights in this convent? But anyway, after taking her vows, she experiences these strange dreams and later is found to be pregnant, despite the fact of her being a virgin. The church believes this is a sign from God and her child is blessed and may be the savior they have been waiting for. Cecilia is not so sure. As she moves throughout the trimesters of the pregnancy, she begins to experience strange things, and the nuns and priests around her treat her differently in various ways, some as a messiah and some as wary and unworthy. Now, I won't go too deep on the plot because it's not terribly complicated and there are very few actual surprises in this film, given what we already know about the nuns in the cold open. I will say, sticking to the underdone category, there are elements that they hint at that they never actually deliver on as well. Namely, she experiences a bit of body horror through her pregnancy, which is never actually explained or makes sense in the final moments. The one thing I will say is I guess I was impressed that they decided to lean more into the science realm than religion for the central plan they're trying to accomplish. But, given the antiquated setting, it also felt a little out of place too. But to its credit, the movie did move along at a pretty good pace. And the performances, for the most part, were solid, although I have to admit, I go back and forth on Sydney Sweeney. I think at this point, I've seen her in 3 movies, and all 3 movies were completely different genres from each other. Now, I never saw Euphoria, where she got her big breakout role, but my key takeaway from all 3 of those films was that it's basically just Sydney Sweeney in fill in the blank. I find she has very little range and basically acts the same no matter what character she's portraying. I won't go so far as to call her a bad actor because I don't think that's the case, but compare her to her counterpart in First Omen, Nell Tiger Free, where she felt like that character and not Nell Tiger Free as that character, if that distinction makes any sense. And to take this a little further, I feel like to an extent all 3 movies that I've seen Sydney Sweeney in could have literally been the same character at different times of her life. That everything coming out of her feels kind of the same. I mean, that's not a new thing for actors. Some actors change themselves to fit roles, and sometimes roles have to be changed to fit them. She seems like she fits into the latter category. Now, the problem with changing the roles to fit the actor is it can have a negative impact because not every role can work being changed. This movie felt like hey, we can get Sydney Sweeney in this role. And they just did it, even though I think this role required more stretching than what I think Sweeney can do. I'm reminded of the movie Saint Maud, which also is about a woman dealing with potentially sainthood, but how Morfydd Clark was an embodiment of that role. Like, she doesn't do much overtly, but you feel her internal struggle as well as her struggle with life around her. I mean, maybe that's not fair because Immaculate is more of a surface level horror film, but it is all relevant. And I would bet if you put Morfydd Clark, or Nell Tiger Free for that matter, in Immaculate, you would get a much more harried, nuanced performance in this film. I think it would just feel really different. As a matter of fact, if we want to get crazy, I would love to take Arkasha Stevenson, who directed First Omen and Nell Tiger Free, or for that matter, Rose Glass, who directed Saint Maud and Morfydd Clark, and give them the same script as Immaculate, and I bet anything it would be a much more memorable and powerful film. I mean, in the end, the movie itself works when it has to, and it doesn't hurt itself with any real dumb story points or bad decisions. But except for the last few minutes of the film, it's just not super memorable. I'd give this movie a B-, but let me know what you think.